Chapters 31 and 32, The Roaring Twenties, Introduction. Here, for your pleasure and historical titillation, is the lecture on that zany party decade of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, as it was called, and has been called ever since. There was, as you will discover, a lot more to it than speakeasies, gangsters, flappers, and the decadence of the Great Gatsby. Still, it was America's first fling with the widespread prosperity of which the industrial age was capable, and the country's first decade of shameless self-indulgence on a national scale. Everybody would suffer the inevitable hangover later, that's true, but you will learn about that in the next lecture. In this lecture, it's still party time. You will learn the 8 reasons why Americans were ready for party time on a national scale in the 1920s, after having come through the rigors and challenges of the Great War in Europe. You will learn how and why American social beliefs reflected a new insularity in this decade, a kind of fortress attitude, a defensive posture of protection of what people considered time-honored American values. It wasn't a good time in the 1920s to be offering alternatives to such values, and you will learn several examples of this. Immigration was a very big issue in the 1920s, just as big as it is today, and you will learn how Congress changed immigration law to reflect popular opinion about it. You will also learn the 2 schools of thought concerning what the proper role of immigrants should be in American life and culture. You will learn about prohibition, and the 18th Amendment, too, which seemed to be so out of place in the party decade of the Roaring Twenties, but were passed anyway, and you will be equipped at the end of this lecture to make some accurate guesses why they were passed anyway. On a related theme, you will learn about the rise of the gangster culture in the 1920s, and I'm not talking about youth gangs. I'm talking about professional gangs like the Chicago Mafia of Al Capone. There were reasons why professional criminals found fertile ground in which to plant their seeds of violence and corruption in the 1920s, and you will learn what those reasons were. At the other end of the moral spectrum, religion was very popular in America during this decade too, because its promised panaceas seemed to offer the antidote to the social pathologies created by gangs, immigrants, and too much booze and riotous living, especially in the crowded and bustling, sin-soaked cities. The proselytizers of religion as a source of American values ran up against a problem, however, and that was the influence of science as a competing source of values, particularly the science of evolution as described by Charles Darwin. It all came to a head in the famous Scopes monkey trial in 1925, in which both sides tried to make a monkey out of the other in the popular press. You will learn the arguments both sides made, and, just so you know, the arguments have not changed in 100 years, notwithstanding all the impressive science that has been discovered since. At the end of this lecture, you will be able to explain, and to defend, both sides. You will also be able to explain why the age of consumerism, with which you are already familiar, as are your parents, was invented in the Roaring Twenties. Why then, and not earlier? The industrial age, which made it all possible, had been, after all, growing for 30 years. Professional sports, the 3 Bs, baseball, basketball, and boxing, now became consumer entertainment too. Yet Americans had been playing these sports for decades before the 1920s. Why did the 1920s become the decade of stadiums, iconic sports heroes, and traveling teams whose win-loss record millions of Americans followed with rabid enthusiasm? You will find out. And you will find out why Americans suddenly became much more mobile in this decade, too. On the road, on the rails, and even in the air. You didn't have to leave the house to travel on the wings of your imagination, though, because the radio revolution happened during the Roaring Twenties also, as families gathered around the radio to hear the news from all over the country, and to enjoy entertainment from soap operas to real operas, travelogues to sitcoms, comedy to commentary. It was all invented in the 1920s. You will learn about the technology that made all of this rather miraculously possible, and who developed it. And if that wasn't enough news and entertainment for you, you could spend 25 cents and go to the movies as well. The modern movie, with its ability to emotionally transport the viewer into new worlds of fabricated reality, was invented in the 1920s. And Hollywood was invented as the place to make the movies. That's a kind of Wild West story all by itself. So much new was happening in the country, in fact, that life in America became a kind of cultural laboratory. From morals to manners, flappers to feminists, race cars to race relations, pop psychology to pop music, Americans were redefining themselves in this zany and frenetic decade, questioning everything and exploring new ways to enjoy life. You could spend an entire school year just reading the works of the giants of American literature who became cultural icons in the Roaring Twenties. In this lecture, I give you a summary, so you can get the vibe of the period. And of course, the vibe of the period, which became a raucous march to hedonism and adventure, eventually dissolved into a cacophony of disaster when the overheated stock market, which was fueling the good times with phony money, collapsed, and you will learn all about that sad denouement too, when the riotous party suddenly ended with investors jumping out of the windows of tall buildings and millions of ordinary Americans losing everything, their jobs, their homes, their fortunes, and their futures. The Roaring Twenties, regrettably, ended up being a roar of pain, and you will learn how and why that happened. You will by that time have some useful insights into if it could happen again, too. There's another good idea for a term paper for your history teacher, by the way. Before you start on it, though, you would do well to learn as much about the politics of the period as you learn about the nonstop party, because the party was enabled by the politics. And while the party made the future look as promising as it was fun, the politics that enabled it were just as bold a reactionary thrust in the other direction, into the past. A case can be made that this was inevitable, because the 1920s was a decade of self-absorption, of Americans having fun and consuming as much as they could, even going in debt to do it. Yes, that part of the consumer culture was invented at this time, too. And nobody was much interested in those days in the old idealistic ambitions of Woodrow Wilson, or in the social justice projects of the progressives, needed though they might still be, because all of that was a lot of work. And anyway, there was no money in it. There weren't going to be any more crusades to bring power back to the people, or justice to the justice system, or wages to the working class, or profits to the farmer, or education to the children, or any of that, while everybody was having such a rip-roaring good time making life an adventure in the new consumer age. In politics, we know now, when you take your eye off the politicians, they retreat into their accustomed good old boy networks to enlarge their power, fatten themselves on the taxpayers' money, make sweetheart deals with the plutocrats of the industrial establishment, usually also at taxpayers' expense, marginalize any legislation that might actually have something to do with the public interest when it conflicts with their own, and distract the voters with bread and circuses to hide their scams and schemes, as long as they can. The only difference at that point between a democracy and a dictatorship is that in a dictatorship the people can't do anything about it, whereas in a democracy they can, if they choose to. In the 1920s, Americans chose not to, for 9 years. So, for all practical purposes, people were living in a reincarnation of the pre-progressive era of the robber barons, again in the 1920s, politically speaking. President Warren Harding said that Americans longed for a return to normalcy, and this is what he meant. His successor, Calvin Coolidge, said that the business of America was business, and he dutifully and predictably danced the tune piped to him by the plutocrats. And lest we forget, the rest of the world did not stop turning just because the Americans were not answering the phone when former allies and friends tried to call from overseas during these years. Americans would later learn that when they take a vacation from world affairs, the world falls apart pretty quickly. Fall apart it did, creating power vacuums for the European dictators and Asian militarists to fill in the 1930s. Back on the home front, though, Before we say goodbye to this tempestuous decade, I'll show you in detail how and why it so precipitously and calamitously ended, and why in fact it could not have ended any other way. History's cause and effect patterns do have a certain inevitability about them, a pattern I hope you are noticing, and there is in fact plenty in the history of the Roaring Twenties that could have predicted, or at least sketched, the country's economic future for the next 100 years. The decade of the 1920s is, therefore, a useful drama to learn about in modern American history, not just because it was a lot of adolescent fun in the short run, but because the lessons learned from it are a relevant cautionary tale for modern times. This lecture takes you through the whole play, from when the curtain first rose in Act 1 to when it came crashing down, along with the theater itself, on the revelers both on stage and in the audience 10 years later.